Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hannick here and co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes. Our special guest, a returning guest, is Christopher Zehnder, educator and author, and so much an educator that in a number of cases he wrote the book for the course. Today we're going to be revisiting a rowdy reading room, the Tamworth Reading Room, and we're doing so with an eye to the coming canonization of John Henry Cardinal Newman, who under the pen name Catholicos wrote the Tamworth Reading Room in two sections to the venerable times of England back in the day, but the issues are very much with us today. We begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Just a bit of a background. Cardinal Newman's canonization is scheduled for this coming October 13th. And he's going to be the first Englishman or Englishwoman. He's going to be the first Englishman to be canonized in recent times. We might even say modern times. While the martyrs during the Protestant revolt were canonized, they lived centuries ago, whereas Newman is much closer to our own day. Now, this troublesome Tamworth Reading Room was established in 1841, and I've read that it was the precursor of London University. Its president, ex officio, was Sir Robert Peel. Robert Peel was twice the Prime Minister of England, and he's credited with founding what today is referred to as the Conservative Party, up from Toryism. And if anybody's trying to think of the name of a famous Tory, you need go no further than Samuel Johnson, who was a Tory and sometimes referred to as a radical Tory. At any rate, Robert Peel lived from 1788 to 1850, and he was joined in establishing the Tamworth Reading Room by the founder of the Edinburgh Review and the one-time Lord Chancellor of England, and a prominent and pugnacious Whig. We don't have any Whigs in American politics, although I can think of a few people who could use a good Whig. But at any rate, this individual was Lord Henry Brougham, and he lived from 1778 to 1868. But the reading room itself was established in 1841. And, well, Newman had a number of things that he wanted to say about the reading room. And he did so with a careful view, citing this passage and that point of his opponents. And in his advocacy for the reading room, Sir Robert Peel tells us the following, that we will, every one of us, if we can pay the 1 shilling that was the annual due for membership in the reading room, tells us that in becoming wiser, we will become better. And furthermore, if we were to frequent the reading room, we will rise at once in the scale of intellectual and moral existence. And becoming accustomed to such contemplations as we might carry out in the reading room, we will feel the moral dignity of his nature, our nature, her nature. Our moral dignity will be exalted. Now, if I haven't sounded entirely convinced, it's maybe because I haven't frequented such reading rooms enough, or maybe because I just don't spend enough time reading and thinking about matters, practical matters, especially practical matters as they might affect the established political parties of the day. But the crux of what Peel is saying, and plenty of people have thought this, in becoming wiser, we will become better. Now, I know that my colleagues this morning, both Mario and Christopher, spend a good deal of time teaching people. What do you think, gentlemen? If you teach well and your students learn well and they become wiser, will they become better? Yeah, they're stumped. They're stumped, you can tell.
Yeah. It certainly seems like they should, right? I mean, that was sort of what Plato said, and Thomas Jefferson famously said, there's no sin, only error. Because it seems like if we know what is good for us, we would want to do what was good for us. So the key is basically to tell people what is good for them, and they will do what is good for them. However, experience doesn't seem to bear that out very well. So, yeah, in one sense, you do become, if you're wiser, you are better, insofar as, I get, on one level, obviously it's a perfection of the mind. Secondly, if you become, it disposes, I mean, in a certain way, knowledge of the good disposes one to do the good, because we can't actually do the good unless we know what it is. But that it actually by itself bring that eventuality, that to realization is doubtful at best. Witnessed against by all experience, both of other people and of oneself.
What? Well, Professor Ramos Reyes is starting a new semester. Do you anticipate that your students will become not just better students, but better people?
Well, it's this is a very unique, I think, question. The quick answer, I think, is I don't know. But let me begin by saying the following. There is a widespread assumption that schooling or taking a class or even teaching a course will make a student be better. Not only better intellectually, better as a people. Now, if that is the case, can we somehow, I'm going to use another word, measure this behavior? Probably not. But there is a widespread assumption, I think, in the American establishment that when you convey certain kind of content, and in this case, we see that Mr. Peel talked about useful knowledge. That is what will make people successful, will make people better. But then there is a wall between, I think, the teacher and the students. And what is that wall about? We cannot get into their character formation, so to speak. We assume that it's enough for us to transmit those useful knowledge, this content of subject matter, even subject matter which in themselves may be useful, if you, I want to use the word, to build their character. Imagine someone teaching ethics or moral philosophy. Well, what type of moral philosophy do we teach? Do we teach really the rule of the game, how to go about and become successful, go about and become more autonomous? Or do we show the student how they can build their own characters? Well, we cannot do that because a wall there, because there is a connection, or there is a connection, presumably, between virtue and religion, and we cannot cross that barrier. So to some extent, we are trapped in a constitutional system where the only thing we can do is transmit those useful knowledge and expect not only that they know, they get the training, the knowledge about their profession, but assuming that that knowledge will make them better citizens. So I think I see that situation today, and personally I have sometimes some uneasy way of presenting certain topics, because I see that it's not enough the content that I can transmit, rather than there is something else that we need to deal with, but we have this limitation. Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I wonder, is it, so when you're talking about that there has to be something else, I mean, there's teaching one does in the classroom, and then there's education which occurs in the home, and you brought up something else, there's a kind of education which occurs, say, in a church. Is any of that kind of education simply defined as conveying knowledge or information? Is any of that ever, can it even be sufficient for virtue? If not, what is?
So your question is whether what are being taught at home and churches is
right,
it's not education.
No, I'm saying. I guess my question is the question seems to be becoming wiser. One will become better, but there's different ways one can become wise, or there's different avenues by which one gains wisdom. One of those could be in an institution of learning, whether middle school, high school, or university. It can also be one can become wiser in one's home through tutelage by one's parents, and one can become wiser through religion. What is it? Is when we're talking about simply the teaching of what is right and wrong, is that ever in any case sufficient? Or if it's not sufficient, what is added to that teaching? Conveyance of ideas and that will make it sufficient.
Well, what I gather from Newman's proposal is precisely that education is more complex than just transmitting a set of principles, a set of norms, or conveying a collection of facts. Education is more than that. Otherwise, it's reduced to perhaps merely training. So if that is the case, yes, somebody who is receiving that on the other end is going to absorb and convey that, or have a feedback and become wiser intellectually with that content. And that person is going to apply this into reality. Now, is that all that there is in the process of communication between the learner and the teacher? Probably not, because the learner need not only know things but live by certain things. Now, is there any possibility of transmitting how to live just by transmitting those principles? Well, the whole tradition, I think, classic tradition would say no. There is something else. In other words, it's not only speculative knowledge that is going to make people better. It maybe make people wiser, but not better. There is a practical knowledge, the knowledge of ethics. Now, how then we teach ethics? Is ethics just reduced to certain principles, certain formality, as modern moral philosophy has been proposing, or there is something else? Now, if that's something else, then we need a different approach to education. That approach can be more easily applied within the home or the church. Is that possible in a classroom where we are somehow regulated by separation of church and state? And generally, the assumption is that if you are going to start proposing a certain disposition or virtue ethics, that is seen as something part of a religion. And since religion cannot be brought into this setting, then we are somehow trapped in this dilemma. What do we need to do?
Yeah, I think that's correct. But in a certain sense, even training in the home is a kind of education, right?
Yes.
I mean, obviously, we deal with our children in a different way we deal with our students. As the various ways we can deal with them is different, and we have a much more, integral effect on them than we ever will have in our students. So virtue it would require the education, right? It would require the teaching of what is right and wrong. But there's a kind of discipline that's added to it in the home, for instance, that you can't actually achieve in the classroom fully. I'm thinking more so in terms of just without bringing religion into it directly yet, but just how, like say on the natural level, we would raise children, assuming that there could be a kind of natural virtue without at least a revealed religion.
Right, because one of the observations made by Newman is that the claim made by Peel, he says, if they are the learners, so to speak, the students, are merely taught to read, then they dissipate their mind by trifling or vicious publications. So education is reduced to the cultivation of the intellect. And useful knowledge is the great instrument of education. It is the parent of virtue. And
yeah, it's interesting.
Right, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
And then says something more interesting. He says, then is also the nurse of religion. It excels man to the highest perfection, and is the sufficient scope of his most earnest exertions. That's a very interesting thesis, I think. Go ahead.
Okay, I think it's interesting with Peel here is that he's assuming even a narrower kind of education, I think, than any of us would consider, right? It's not even clear that he's necessarily considering ethics. It's talking about useful knowledge, almost like empirical science really is what he's talking about. Somehow contemplation of that is going to be sufficient to raise people up. I think it's a surprising thing to me that anybody would hold that. I think wouldn't be necessarily so surprising to some people of our time at least.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
I think something went wrong with my connection.
Okay.
That's fine. We've been holding on down the fort.
I think I got disconnected. I was trying to do the right thing, but modern technology wasn't enough.
We should have known there was something wrong when you were so silent. Jim.
Well, I kept saying, hold on. And that didn't work, so I shifted to, wait for me, Wild Bill. Now, I was listening to you fellows, and I want you to comment on a number of remarks that people make about this connection between being wiser and being better. I've got 3 or 4 things in mind, and I'm going to propose these as tests for your respective, if not respectable, positions. You oftentimes hear people say, you can't solve a problem just by throwing money at it. How about this? Most of our major problems, say gun violence, you can pretty much solve by throwing education at them. Is that right? Can you?
Again, I think, Jim, we need to deal with the word education. What does education mean?
All right, so what kind of education you throw at them?
What type of education are we talking about there? Because,
all right. Now, here's the next one. There's this redoubtable fellow, John Henry Newman, who says, does he have it right? To know is one thing, to do is another. The two things are altogether distinct. To know is one thing, to do is another. The two things are altogether distinct.
Yeah.
What about that? Are they altogether distinct?
I don't know what he means exactly, altogether distinct, because one can't do without knowing. Even
you have to know
in
something.
Arts or in normal life. Yeah, if I want to do what is just, or I want to deal justly in a particular circumstance, I have to know what the just thing is.
Right.
So I need that knowledge.
Perhaps we need to make a distinction without separation, as the old scholastic
all right, whoa, that sounds good. So you want to distinguish between knowing and doing.
Yeah.
But they're not separated.
Yeah.
You want to distinguish between the intellect and the will.
Exactly.
But they're not separated. It's the person who acts. Always it's the person who acts, not just the intellect, not just the will.
Right.
How about this? Now, I'm going to get earthy with this one. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Well, that's essentially true.
Suppose someone says, all this blather, these teachers are blathering away. My grandpa knew, and he told me often enough, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Is that what all this comes down to?
So how then you teach a group of students? By example. Now, can you force them to follow your example? Probably not. Can you inspire them? Probably, to some extent. Are you able to make them drink the water of wisdom? You can stimulate them, but again, you are confronting their freedom. So then we go back to the original question. How then we teach? What is the best method? We can go back to Plato.
All right, now I'm going to work this horse analogy a little bit. suppose you lead a horse to water and the horse won't drink. Is it going to help if you bend over and drink from the trough?
Probably not with a horse.
Not with a horse.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
all right.
I think if you're talking about living, give me an example of how to live. I think it does help.
Okay, now how about if we switch from Grandpa to Aristotle? Aristotle said, and I quote him loosely, damn barbarians, they haven't been brought up right, and if you haven't been brought up right, there's no help for you. You gotta grow up in a polis, preferably Athens, in order to know what the right thing to do is, and then you'll do it. Unless you've got, and he was puzzled by this, unless you've got some sort of weakness of your will, you'll do the right thing. But of course, you won't do the right thing if you don't know the right thing, and you won't know the right thing if you're living outside of Athens. God help you, you might be raised in Sparta, and then there'll be hell to pay.
Well, so the social context of your society is therefore determinative of whether you're going to live by virtue or not, according to that.
Dang barbarians, they barely had any kind of a contract. Well, all right. Now, somebody else might say, look, you gentlemen, you purport to be Catholic scholars, but what's going on here is in a sneaky sort of way, you're leading us to the position that there's this gap between fact and value. And David Hume, no stranger to John Henry Newman, David Hume said a fact is a fact and a value is a value, and people keep talking about facts, but they never get to a value because you can't. If you're just talking about facts, you have to change the melody and talk about values. Is there an acceptance of the fact-value distinction in what Newman is saying? To know is one thing, to do another. The two are altogether distinct.
So, by fact, you mean the actual
stuff you can see to know.
Yeah. So one ought to be temperate in eating and drinking. That's the fact. The value is I want to be temperate. Is that correct? That's the way of distinguishing them?
I embrace temperance as a value.
I am. Okay. Yes, I think there is. There is a distinction there.
Well, then, all the stuff about natural law, who cares what the nature of things is? That's just a factual point. We can argue about it, but the nature of things is this or that. The nature of the human is this or that. But why not say, yeah, well, that's our nature, but, well, I've just heard about this new position of being tri-modular, and I want to try out being tri-modular.
Well, yeah, I mean that's it's not to say that the facts are going to be what is the nature of man and how man ought to live, what acts he should do, what acts he should avoid. That remains true, and it remains something by which we ought to live if we're going to be happy, truly happy as human beings, and operate according as human beings. But there certainly is the element where I could decide to resist that. And the reason why we go to confession is that we often resist it.
Well, here now I'm still riffing along here. Could it be that there are facts and values, but values are embedded in facts? And could it be that there are facts in one form and values in another form, but it's just a fact that certain values are of great worth? It's just a fact that cruelty is a disvalue. It's just a fact that courage is a value.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Mario, where are we going wrong? Or are we going right, or are we just practice shooting?
I'm thinking about whether the context in which the discussion was held by Newman the idea of liberalism as understood by him, or understood by, in general, how he somehow described liberalism, is very important. Because if it seems that I think the idea of Mr. Peel is find a way of preserving peace and safety. He's on a statement. Was going to be prime minister and so on. But this goal was very low, just preserve peace, as liberalism of his time was. Mainly, I just come to my mind, the idea of Hobbes. So it's lower the standard, so to speak. But then I think Newman seems to suggest that there is another way of doing this, which is the task of, or the goal of the regime, or the classical regime, which was to shape character. Now, if that then is the case of a political regime to shape character, then it is not enough just useful knowledge. There should be something else. Now, they are not separated. They can be distinguished. And so what are those values? Where do those values come from in order to shape how we ought to be, not how we know things? Well, that area, if you will, come from, I think, Newman said, from holier places than libraries. So my point is that we perhaps cannot separate the reflection on education from the reflection of the political regime.
Yes, and what do you think about this language right from Sir Robert Peel himself? He wants this a library to be a source for progress, and we're not going to have progress if we have discord. So Robert Peel says that there is a preliminary and fundamental rule for the reading room. Preliminary and fundamental rule: no works of controversial divinity shall enter into the library.
Exactly. And that is a
works of controversial divinity shall enter into the library.
Right. That sounds Hume. Yeah. That sounds the priority of civil order.
Yes, and he says this too. Exactly. And Peel says, after all, this institution is going to be open to all persons of all descriptions, without reference to political opinions or religious creed. It's an edifice. He wants an edifice in which men of all political opinions and all religious feelings may unite in the furtherance of knowledge without the asperities of party feeling. Sounds like he's just promoting civility and speaking out against divisiveness.
Right. The assumption is, again, there. You mentioned a couple of times the word feelings attached to religion. That comes from Hume. And I think that's an assumption today. That was saying when you were gone. That is what you confront in class. And so to what extent you can deal with certain religious claims. And when you do that, that perhaps is not good for the student, because the assumption behind them is that is related to feelings. That is related to something irrational. And in class, we are doing something rational. So it's better for us to talk about chemistry or to talk about hard facts and not about philosophical or religious claims, which are based on feelings. So the question again is, how then we are about rearrange our political system so that we can persuade, or we can have the possibility of making a religious claim but not reduce the religious claim to just a feeling rather than something reasonable.
Now, you mentioned David Hume. Just about 100 years before the opening of the Tamworth Reading Room, promoted by the Prime Minister of England, just about 100 years before, in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume wrote, quote, "When we run over libraries, what havoc must we make?" Yeah, that was just those fundamentalists who were wreaking havoc in the libraries. At any rate, Hume says, when we run over libraries, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, all right, test questions. Does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? Any math? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? Science? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Those are strong words.
What's interesting is that I think Hume is more honest in terms of what the actual goals are than Peel. Peel wants to be rather kindly about all this. We're going to tolerate. It's rather like our own society. We will tolerate religion. We'll tolerate these benighted folks, but we won't take them seriously. Hume is more, we're going to take their works and consign them to the flames, on the assumption both have that the only form of knowledge can be gotten through measurement, through empirical means.
Right.
And
it's
so
intriguing that Robert Peel had the double first at Cambridge in math and classics. And classics. So the business about it is involving math, and of course math is the language of science, or does it involve science? That would appeal to him. Well, here's the test case of all test cases, and at some places you're not supposed to bring this to school. When we talk about controversial divinity, is there or is there not controversial divinity in Scripture?
Read St. Paul, or one could also read our Lord. His disputes with the Pharisees was certainly a form of controversial divinity, but especially St. Paul, but the Judaizers and others alike. Controversial divinity is it's always been at the heart of Christian religion. To exclude it would be essentially to say that what the Christian faith has to say about anything is unimportant.
All right, so Robert Peel and David Hume and Lord Brougham and those who touted the Tamworth Reading Room would actually exclude Scripture, which of course I'm sure they would allow people to read at home, but evidently not in the Tamworth Reading Room. Unless, of course, they read Scripture as literature.
Exactly.
Just read it as literature. And, of course, the authors of Scripture didn't think of it as first and foremost literature.
Well, it's something similar, right? Is it somewhat similar to philosophy? And you can answer this in the university. You don't pursue philosophy in many places because, for the sake of truth, you pursue philosophy as a kind of history of human thought.
Yeah, right. Well, now there's a whole other angle on this that we haven't explored yet. Actually, there are two, but I'm going to look at the angle that we really haven't looked at all, and it's an angle that has philosophical pedigree. Some people might say that what we really want to have philosophy for in the first place, and we could extend this to branches of learning, say literature or history, how about this, that the chief merit of the humanities is that while we are thinking of the humanities, we will be free of grief, anxiety, passion, ambition, hatred. You want to become reflective, don't you? And insofar as you're reflecting on things worthy of reflection, well, at least this will be the case. You might not get at the truth. There might not even be any truth, but you will be free of grief, anxiety, passion, ambition, hatred. And for our students, we might say, let's get them to think about noble thoughts. And if they're thinking about noble thoughts, they won't be unruly and riotous and all of that stuff that's associated with students.
One wonders how that can happen if you've already precluded morality and God and all these non-empirical topics from truth.
Yeah.
How can you inspire somebody to noble action when you can't determine what noble action is?
Well, suppose we just agree that they'll do better reading the Iliad and the Odyssey than they would if they didn't. And if they can really read these great classics, that will have a good effect on them. They won't be caught up in their passions and their ambitions.
Like Achilles.
Well, you see, they'll read about what happens to people who are caught up in their passions. Of arms and men I sing, yeah, and look how the song goes. What do you say, Mario? Could you say, well, at the very least, when I have them studying philosophy and history and literature, they'll calm down.
Well, but again, imagine that you are talking to someone who doesn't know much about philosophy, and you tell him or her that you are teaching philosophy. What is the common assumption among people about what philosophy is? And most of the time, people assume philosophy is a discourse, it's a narrative, it's an explanation about reality. It has nothing to do with how people can become. It's nothing to do that philosophy also can help people to become, as Newman said, or better. Has nothing to do with what we may say with modern language, ethic of conduct. It's more about rules, rule of the game, or an explanation about those rules. So the whole notion of philosophy today has become just a game. And so if that then is the assumption, and I think most of the time that is the assumption of some people, I think it's mistaken. And so why then philosophy should be taught in universities? University is the place for useful knowledge. Let's fill the curriculum with STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. That is the way to go in order to be successful. Now, the question then you can raise, well, where these people are going to learn about how to be better? Well, at home, or they may say in our churches, because this is the place for that. But then the public square should be reduced, educationally speaking, to hard sciences. And so, but again, Mr. Peel seems to be suggesting there that if that then is the case, that will be enough even to build their own character. And so that assumes an anthropology which I don't think is the appropriate one. I see there a hidden view of utilitarianism or consequentialism or looking at only a certain aspect of reality which are not precisely personalist anthropology.
It's sort of like a sedative.
Yes.
Yeah, we order society by a sedative. And
Exactly.
It's not clear to me why that's going to be more effective than, say, indulging in movies or internet games or something else of the sort. It seems you could achieve the same end probably more effectively by those means than you can by...
Do you know, I always like to at some point get back to California, although my worthy friend Christopher Zehnder at some point wanted to get out of California.
I did.
Just a couple of blocks from a university that was founded on a bluff and maintained on that same premise. Just a couple of blocks from Loyola Marymount University a couple of weeks ago, a big billboard advertising home delivery of cannabis. It used to be that you could get pizza delivered to the dorm. But, you know, if it had pepperoni on it, who knows what havoc that would wreak. So you can have cannabis delivered to your room, whether it be a house or an apartment. And I don't know for sure whether the university allowed such deliveries on campus, but I don't know how it could prohibit a legal effort such as that. And also one thing that's going to for sure beat out any presidential debate in terms of ratings, I mean, people get worked up in presidential debates, would be Monday Night Football. It's going to get higher ratings. And so if we think of philosophy as something that is useful because it makes people stoical, say, it reduces their hostilities, say, if we think that in general about the humanities, well, that might be so in some cases. I don't know if you read Nietzsche. I don't think it would reduce your hostilities. But there are easier ways to do that. Drugs, entertainment, sports as entertainment. And it seems that that's what's going on in our society right now. Very few people will say we need to calm the passions of the young. Let's assign more readings in the humanities. But what we want to do is make it easier and easier and easier to be entertained, and easier and easier and easier to be calmed. And the trouble with alcohol is it leads to a lot of fights, but pot, that's much better. Well, now here's another angle that we could look at the whole thing from, and I think this approaches what some people have in mind by critical thinking. Bentham, right, who comes after David Hume, but Jeremy Bentham, who along with John Stuart Mill would be a contemporary of Sir Robert Peel. Bentham argued that at least you get this with education. Check out people who don't have any education, and they're very likely to be confused about what's in their own interest. Check out people who don't have any education, and they're very likely to be confused about what will truly be enjoyable for them. But an educated man at least can identify his own interest and is much more able to figure out what will lead to true enjoyment and what won't. And so we have all kinds of programs whereby we can improve ourselves by getting a better sense of what our interest is. That much we can do at least. We can at least clarify our values. That's better than nothing. And so let's do that because that's something that's doable. How's about that for an approach?
Well, it assumes, right, a certain account of what man is. Before we can talk about what's going to make us happy, we have to talk about what we are. So his account seems reductionist at best.
So you could be educated in STEM. You could be at the heart of the STEM.
Yeah.
You could be STEM-wise, but not know what your own interest really is.
Right.
You can be a PhD even.
So there's a certain kind of education that's not going to help you at all to really identify your own interest. In fact, as they say in England, or they said in England, at least during the days of another eminent British philosopher who had theories on education, Bertrand Russell, the man on the Clapham omnibus who is not educated might actually have come by way of good sense to know his own interests better than the educated man does. If the educated man is only educated in matters pertaining to the STEM.
Yes, one of the Newman cited one gentleman also to reinforce his comment on Peel, Mr. Brougham, I think it was. And he said something along these lines. He said, well, then the knowledge that we are talking about here, which he called physical knowledge, is pure delight, pure gratification. And then he goes on and said something even more puzzling. He said, well, and because it brings the tendency to purify and elevate. Elevate means nature. Elevating and refining it. And giving giving dignity and importance to the enjoyment of life. So the question is, I think, again, there is an assumption about human nature, what human nature is. And so there is a visible influence of Bentham, I think, in this claim. And let me just refer to something that, some situation that is happening in emerging democracies today in Latin America, which is the following. Many of these democracies are going through crisis, economic crisis, some of them political crisis, constitutional ones, and threat of impeachment and so on, which are part of the democratic life. We are not talking about here Venezuela, which is a different case, a separated case. But then when you talk to some politician, even people from civil society, the claim made by them is we need more education. And when you ask again the question, what type of education are you talking about? They say, well, science, technology, we don't have sciences, the hard sciences, we don't have technology, we don't have engineers, and so we need the infrastructure so that our democracy can run smoothly. We don't run this crisis, which is due to this lack of development, and so mathematical, science, technology are going to provide that. We need to send kids to study this science, this discipline, and that will be the solution to our woes. Well, the assumption there is precisely the assumption of Mr. Peel, because many of these power brokers in those developing countries are very well educated, and yet the crisis is there. So there is something else there which has been abandoned, which I would argue is an education in virtue or the way by which you become better. And that has been because of this disconnection or the lack thereof of good evangelization on the part of the church. And so that part of the cushion of any democracy about certain values that come from religion was completely abandoned. Now, who occupy this space today that was abandoned by the church? Well, some fundamentalist way of doing things or Gnostics views, etc. And so now those democracies which lack values are in crisis, and then we resort to these disciplines or sciences which in themselves are good, but that is not all that there is. Human anthropology, human notion of what is a human person is more than that. And my last point, I think, is very telling of what happened. I love soccer. I like soccer games, right? Soccer. Now, there is a change in rules in soccer today, which began a couple of months ago, which is all across the board. Okay, in other words, in Latin America, it's very common. And the change of the rule is that many referees have made mistakes over the past 10 years, and some corruption has been going on. And so what the solution proposed by Association of Latin American Soccer Team was to introduce technology. And the technology is what is called VAR, V-A-R, Video Assistant Referee. So it's pretty much what we do in football, American football. So they look back and see what happened during a particular situation through a video, and then they come up with an assessment about what happened. So what is happening right now is people are complaining about those referees who are behind the VAR. In other words, they tried to solve a moral problem with technology. But technology in itself is being managed by human beings, which in themselves are making the same mistake as before. So instead of addressing the issue from, what we need is to educate referees to be better, to be honest, transparent, decent people, then we add the game technology, and it's not solving the issue.
If I may, I'd like to make a couple points quickly. First is that I think the people who are proposing technology as an answer are partly right, because there's a certain level, of course, of material well-being I think that societies have to have, even to practice virtue. So that always has to be kept into account. It's never sufficient. Secondly, but their idea is based upon actually a religion. And I think if we understand religion as being, in a broader way, as being that which helps us to interpret all of reality, that by which we understand all of reality, which proposes to us sort of highest goods, then everybody has a religion. And Sir Robert Peel had a religion. And what he's basically doing, he's shutting down the debate. He's opposing his religion upon people, and basically a materialistic, technological kind of religion. And that's really what we're up against. That's the big battle. I mean, if we continue to relegate religion to what's just to ritual and that type of thing, we really miss that point. I think that's.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. We are very, very close to the end of our hour. We could I suppose, look to the last lines of Newman's letters to the Times, the Venerable Times, which he himself signed Catholicus. And these last lines are something that Mario alluded to just a while back. At the end of his letter, Newman writes, "If virtue be a mastery over the mind, if its end be action, if its perfection be inward order, harmony, and peace, we must seek it in graver and holier places than in libraries and reading rooms." Of course, Newman was no opponent of libraries and reading rooms. He was just an opponent, a sharp and acute opponent of wolves dressed in the clothing of sheep. And he wanted to identify what was going on with certain libraries and certain reading rooms. Well, let's end, as we always do, with the gospel from today's liturgy. This is from Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks very much. We'll be back next week. God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.